Do you? During the Depression, I was just young enough that I didn't suffer over it because I didn't really understand, except that we had absolutely no money and neither did anyone else. There were a few, naturally there are always wealthy people, but we had nothing. And we paid $15 a month for our home because we didn't own a home until long after we 4 children were married. And we paid $15 a month. And it was a good-sized home. But then they raised it to $35. So we had to move. Because my dad brought home $100 a month, and there was no way to find another $10. That was astronomical. And so we lived very frugally, but then my mother was very frugal, thank goodness, and everybody had gardens, and that's what you depended upon to eat, if you were going to have much to eat. And I don't think hunting was in so much as it was in Gerald's time. They went out and hunted deer and elk so they'd have meat in the house because they had 8 children in their family. But we didn't. And my dad never hunted. He worked in the oil fields, so we didn't have wild meat. I was born and raised in Cody and moved to Lovell when I was ready for high school, and it was the disaster of my life. I thought I couldn't stand to leave Cody. And somebody was kidding me one day about, oh, you'll meet all those Mormons. So when I went home, I said to Mother, what's a Mormon? She says, well, I don't know. I think it's some kind of a cult. I don't know. So when my dad came to get me in Cody to bring me home, because all the rest of the family had moved there because I had been hospitalized, I said, what are the Mormons? He says, oh, just a bunch of cliquish people. Nothing good, that he said. And I felt so bad to think that I had to move there, when, especially for my friends, and then to this kind of like a cult. Well, of course it wasn't that way at all. We learned, we had Mormon friends, we loved them just like I did my friends in Cody.
How was the home life when there was the Depression?
My mother must have been a master at trying to live on $100 a month with 4 children. Now some people lived on $80 a month, so we considered ourselves lucky. But my dad had to live in another town because he couldn't afford to drive home all the time. So we only saw him every 6 weeks to 2 months. And because we couldn't afford the gas. We had all homemade clothes. Very seldom did we have anything but new shoes. And of course they bought stockings. Mother canned everything inside, as did everyone else, because of your gardens. And then you bought fruit at the store by the bushel and canned that, and otherwise we wouldn't have had food. My grandmother was always a wonderful seamstress, and so she made many, even though she didn't live in Cody with us, she made most of our clothes, as did my mother.
Your grandmother did this?
My grandmother was such a good seamstress, and so Mother kind of depended on her because she was busy raising these 4 children, you know, in 5 years. But even she did do some sewing because we did not go to the store except for a pair of shoes, and we went to J.C. Penney's, which was a fairly new line, and you got the shoes for $1.98. Mother had to take turns with which child that month or 6 months got a pair of shoes because they cost $1.98. And so she just had to take turns with the 4 children.
Like, did you have to have any sacrifices? Like, did you have to do any work or stay out of school or anything?
No. I almost died of pneumonia when I was in the 8th year, 14. And Mother kept me home and had the doctor, and at that time, doctors made house calls. And so he came and he said, she's very ill. And then he came back a week later and he said, we've got to rush her to the hospital because we can't control this pneumonia at home. And so I stayed in there 8 days, and I can still remember I went through high school and was married, I'll say 3 or 4 years, when Mother said to me one day, we finally got the hospital bill paid off. So there was no way that you could just pay a hospital bill.
Wow. Okay, so now I'm gonna ask you about like World War II. Like, how was your life then? Like, you were older.
I was older and I had a baby when Grandpa left. And he didn't see her till she was 3 years old. And because he was shipped to England, and we wrote every day to each other, but it was so miserable to not have him, but I was with what we called war widows. All the other ladies in town didn't have their husbands either. So we would group together and go to the drugstore and have a Pepsi once in a while if I happened to have a dime. But often I didn't. Formed like a little, what we called a sewing club. And that was just to get what we call the war widows together and out of the house just for something to do.
Okay, and then like, so what did you do in those 3 years when he was gone?
I just stayed.
Like money-wise, financially.
I got $80 a month, and I had to pay $25. I lived with my parents, and then I just wanted to be out, and I know they wanted us out, even though they adored Judy. There was a little tiny house that's still there in Lovell, just as my parents' house is, and I moved next door and paid $25 a month for the rent, and then I had to live on what I had left, and she was on, at that time you fed babies canned milk if you couldn't breastfeed, and that was $24 a month. And so, believe me, I didn't even get a 10-cent drink too often because that's where my money went.
Oh, and then how did you get the money? Like, did you have
From
to
the
work
government.
For it? Okay, government.
That's government paid every wife so much, and then so much for each child.
Okay. And then like something about rations that I was supposed to ask you.
And then they started rationing, sugar first. And because we had Judy, they counted her in the household. We never lacked to make cakes or pies or fudge or anything, just because we had this little baby. I always felt kind of guilty about that. But people just simply had to learn to do without sugar. And what was the other thing that was important to us? I can't remember. Sugar and oleo, because it was very cheap and it was white. And in a little package was coloring. And I said, why? It's still, the coloring isn't going to make any difference, Mother, because I was living with my parents. And but she couldn't stand it. That yellow was there, and if you waited till it was soft, you took a fork, and mixed it up, and it looked like butter. And there's still oleo today. You know, lots of people eat oleo. You probably, do you eat oleo?
You mean margarine?
Margarine, oleo, margarine, right. Margarine.
How was Pearl Harbor for you?
It was such a shock. I still remember of being in the living room, in the kitchen, my house, in the living room, and all of us were home because it was Sunday and we never were in the church or anything, so we were just home. And we had the radio on, which was all they had at that time, was radios. And all of a sudden they said, we have breaking news. Pearl Harbor has been bombed. And we all looked at each other and said, where is Pearl Harbor? Because very few people knew about that place. I suppose more intelligent people or more out and about people knew, but most people had never heard of it. And we were so shocked, and immediately I thought of my brother who would have to go, and then we were just married. And so we were married right after that, and if you were married, the wife and child got very little money, because so many people rushed out to get married so that they could get this government allotment. And I got $80 a month and was glad to get that, because I don't know whether I mentioned it, the little house I rented, yeah, I did, $25, so that I could get out away from, so I didn't have to be in the house with my parents, because their house was so small. Because all the boys, men, everybody was gone. There was nothing to do in Lovell, and there still isn't, as far as that goes. There's nothing to do. But there were, we always went to all the dances and that sort of thing, and of course all the boys were gone, so we couldn't even go dancing. And once in a while, we had enough money to go to the movie, which was, if you went to the Saturday after matinee, it was 10 cents, but if you went at night, it was 50 cents. And most of the time we went to matinee on Saturday because we couldn't afford 50 cents.
Yeah.
My brother and his good friend had left home for the first time. They went to college for a year, and then they lived in California, and they decided to join the Navy because they knew they were going to be drafted. There was more war talk in the cities and down there than there was in a place like Lovell. And they could see it coming. And they were so glad that they joined the Navy. And they didn't have, they weren't in battles or anything like that, but they had good food, clean beds, clean clothes. The Navy just treats you like princesses, And so they were well off and not in a lot of danger. And neither was Grandpa.
Okay. Let's see. So,
The only thing a sad thing that happened while Grandpa was in England was that his good friend from Lovell, you very seldom ran into anyone you knew. And he knew this man, and they got together in London and went to dinner or something, and then he was killed. And so that just ruined the service for him, knowing he had been killed. And we had one other boy that I can remember that was killed, but we knew him, but he was my age, but I didn't know him that well.
So did you guys ever hear much on the radios about what happened in World War II?
War news was on every day, most of the day. There was what was happening in Germany and then first Pearl Harbor was bombed, and then Germany invaded Poland, and America went right to Pearl Harbor to help them. And I don't think we owned Pearl Harbor. I'm just guessing. because we own Pearl Harbor now, but I don't think they did then, which is maybe beside the point. But anyway, they rushed people, their service people, over there to help those in Pearl Harbor, and then they rushed some more to Germany because they were invading Poland, and they were just sweeping the continent, just killing people, to get the territory. They were just trying to extend their territory. And it was very sad. And if you were captured by the Japanese, you either didn't come out, or when you did, they'd either blinded you or cut off your arm, or they tortured people so terribly. And so I don't know that any of our Lovell people were ever caught by the Japanese, but they were prisoner, but it wasn't Japanese, thank goodness. I think it was a German prisoner, if I remember right. I'd forgotten about that, honey. I forgot him.
What happened to him?
You're just taken prisoner, and when you're a prisoner, sometimes you almost starve to death, and they have fleas, bugs, just in some places. Now, when Grandpa was in this service, they had their, of course, cots lined up like you see in movies, and he took his sheets and everything every Monday or whatever and washed them. And other guys that sleep in their sheets for months at a time, they wouldn't be bothered. He says they'd just be black. But Grandpa was just such a clean person, and you had access to the facilities. And he always told about how fun it was to crawl into those clean sheets, just like we loved to crawl into them. And he says, and those other guys would not be bothered.
Did you ever know about what happened with the Jews?
Absolutely.
At the very end?
I should say.
Because
and we never, what?
Because the information wasn't known until the very end of that.
Right.
So when you found out, how was your reaction?
We were appalled. We never had met a Jew. We didn't know anything about their religion or anything like that. But I mean, we were so angry. There was nothing we could do to help them. But it was terrible. Why those Germans hated the Jews so badly, we never did know. But they despised them, and those poor Jews paid for it. Now, I had good friends in Lovell. Their last name was Ota, O-T-A. And he was, the husband was good friends with Grandpa, and I was good friends with her. We played bridge together, that sort of thing. And but the war never came up, as far as the Japanese fighting against the Americans and that sort of thing. It was just something you didn't talk about with them. And I don't know what, I guess their parents suffered terribly because their parents were in Japan. Well, they were from California as far as that goes. But their parents had been over there in the war, and they knew what they were suffering. And they would kind of stay separated from, I felt like they separated from us, but she was in our bridge club, so I guess she didn't feel that way. But they had, their parents and cousins and everything suffered so terribly with the torture that, because I'll tell you, every American, any place, over there or here, we hated the Japanese because they had invaded the white people, the Americans, and tortured them so terribly. And we knew that. So of course we just had such a hatred for them. And I remember they would come in the bowling, he would come in the bowling alley. He was a marvelous bowler. And one of my friends was home on leave from the Navy, and he had come in the bowling alley. And when he saw this Ota, Mr. Ota, boy, I'll tell you, he just made it very pointed that he wasn't going to speak to him or that sort of thing. And I felt so bad because that was so uncalled for. But he was in the service, and I guess when you're fighting someone, you hate them. And so I guess he had a leg to stand on, but they were both Lovelites. So I was on the outside and it didn't seem like that was necessary, but I just remember he would just kind of glare at him because he was Japanese.
So like when they were taken to those camps,
And then those people, I don't know where they came, they shipped them in from California and had an internment camp in Powell, Wyoming, because they had to build camps for these prisoners that we took. And they would let the prisoners out, and Judy and I, she was just 2, had moved to Cody, and I was working in a store, and the Japanese would come in, and the women were so sweet and so nice. I just loved them. And years later, these Otis that lived in Lovell, she and I were in the same bridge club, and I said, I wonder, Marie, if you came in the store where I worked and we saw each other, didn't meet, but I mean saw each other. And she says, I've wondered the same thing, because she says, I remember coming in what they then called the dime store. I took you to the downtown one time when I was taking care of you and your parents were gone, and you were just about like this. And I said, do you have a dime store in Worland? And you says, oh no, we don't have dime stores. Well, you did, but that isn't what it was called. But when we were growing up, that store was things that you could get much cheaper. I mean, they just had cheaper things. They weren't good things, but they were just cheaper. And but oh, my grandma, I'm so sorry, we don't have one. And so when I got to the end of the street, I says, here's the dime store. And so I tried to explain to you what it was. But it was just things that you could get, tissue paper and tablets and everything, much cheaper than you could anyplace else.
That's cool. Let's see. Any other questions?
You know, isn't that funny? I've got to think about that. All I remember is the day it started. We called it Pearl Harbor Day. And it was on Sunday, and we were all home, and on the radio, President Roosevelt announced, we are at war. And we couldn't believe it. War with whom? And they said, the Japanese have invaded Pearl Harbor. Well, we were we were just glued to the radio, because news kept coming in of how many were killed, how many of our airplanes that were just learning to fly or that sort of thing were shot down, because everybody was an enemy to the Japanese. And so they shot down a lot of people that didn't even know there wasn't even a war between us. Of course, there soon was, very quickly. And then we had the war. Germany then invaded Poland, and the Americans went over to help Germany. So we fought, some guys were sent to Germany and some were sent to Japan. That was what was terrible, was to fight 2 wars at the same time.
Do you remember when the war was over?
It was August of 1945. Now, see, it's coming back to me about the end. I remember that date. I used to know the day, but
What date was it?
August of 45. It came, the president was still Roosevelt, and he died right after that. And the war is over. And he just kept saying, the war is over. MDS?
The bombs.
Oh,
Like,
bombs.
did you hear about the bombs?
Oh, what was terrible, the only thing that Grandpa was ever in danger was from Germany, and they never did come into England where Grandpa was. They didn't invade, but they sent buzz bombs. And you never knew they were coming. They were very quiet. And all of a sudden you would hear this terrible screeching. They called them buzz. They sounded like a buzz, a sound. And then everybody would drop to the ground or for shelter or something. Other than that, he was never in danger.
You remember the atomic bomb like, in
I
Japan?
should say so. One day, the president came on the radio and said they have dropped an atomic bomb, which they've had for some time, but they knew it would wipe out people. Well, it not only wiped them out over in Japan, and boy, the war stopped that quick, but it were the people that were burned and had all these scars and things from the shrapnel and everything that was so terrible. We just heard about the scarred people.
And were you happy that the Americans won the war by that, or did you
Oh
feel
no, we
guilty
just were
or
so
what?
happy when they said the war is over, but we have all these people that were scarred so terribly from the truth finally came out. I understand as after I was much older that there was so much of the war that was never reported. Real bad things, and especially in Japan, if you happened to be taken by Japanese, you were tortured constantly. And they said it was, a lot of guys died or came home so crippled. They put their hands in fire, made them hold hot coals in their hands so that their hands were all shriveled when they came home from having to hold them. That was one of the tortures. The only one I can just remember off the top of my head.
And like, how did you take this? Like, did you do anything, or did you just?
No,
Because I mean, it's level,
and
you
we
didn't see
could
much
do
of it.
absolutely nothing. They wanted us, we did buy a couple of war bonds, and they were, I think, $15, and I didn't have $15. But, it was Grandma Doerr that bought them. I didn't have $15 because I had to live on this $80 a month and pay rent and buy baby food. But she bought a couple of war bonds and she ran across them 30 years later, one time in a drawer. And so she just went to the bank and asked if these were any good. He says there's no interest on them, but you get exactly what you paid for them. And she had two, so she got $30. And she, as a widow, lived on nothing. So that $30 was the greatest thing in the world. But she was sure it was worthless, but they were always good. I didn't realize you could turn the bonds in. I never could afford to even buy one.
Like, what were these bonds? Why did you buy them?
You bought them to help to send to the government, to help pay for it. And when you did, then they were going to give it back to you in interest. If you would just help pay for the war. And that's when you got the bonds. And Grandma Doerr got one for Judy in her name. But when she got the money back, of course, I just had her keep it. But
Were there any like gold stars in the windows?
there were blue stars if you had someone in the service. So when you went by a house, if there were 3, now like Grandma Doerr had 4 in World War II, 4 blue stars. And she prayed constantly that she never had to put a gold one in. That means they were dead. One of them had been killed. And so she kept those blue stars in her window for years. So any time you went by someone's house, you could tell how many men or women that they had in the service.
Who had the 4 gold? Oh, the 4.
My mother-in-law,
Oh, okay.
Gerald and his 3 brothers, and then the fifth one went to the Korean War, which was 5 years later. But that's not about Grandpa, so that's beside the point. But she did have 5 in the service, and it almost put her under. She had high blood pressure in the first place, and I'd never seen anybody in my life that worried over if there were anthills or something. I mean, she worried about everything. And I wondered how she lived through having those 5 boys in the service. Have you ever heard of emails?
Like on the computer?
And no, nothing, we never heard that word in the 1940s.
Computer.
But we would send these little, piece of paper that was quite small.
Like a telegram.
No,
Oh.
no, not at all. It was bigger than that. It was about like this, about a foot long and about 6 inches wide.
So this is the email.
This is an email, and you sent one, and I don't know why E. I don't know that we ever knew what the E was. But you sent, I wrote every day, as most wives and sweethearts did. And so, that's what you used was email. And I know Grandpa would get awfully discouraged that it was so small, but I tried to write real small. But when you write every day, there's just hardly anything to say anyway. It's just hard. And I'd tell him what Judy was doing. Well, he didn't even know Judy.
Aw. So how much money was it to spend those emails, like to send an email?
Oh, it's the same postage. The same postage as what you pay for a regular one, but an email went faster, I think. I think it just went through faster. Because they were to service people.
E stood for
I
enlisted.
don't know. I just don't know what email meant. And I asked Grandpa when he got home, and he didn't know either.
That's funny how like email is now on computer and that's just what it's called now.
I'll be darned.
You know about email?
Uh-uh.
You know, like Hotmail or Comcast.
Well, I've heard the words, but I haven't had a computer for so long.
Oh.
Ever since I left Lovell, I haven't had a computer.